Long before the headlines, before the tragedy that would shock the world of wrestling forever, there was just Chris Benoit, a quiet kid from Montreal, Canada, who loved one thing more than anything else: wrestling. From the moment he saw Dynamite Kid perform in the ring, Chris knew that was what he wanted to be. He wasn't tall, he wasn't loud, but he had drive. The kind of drive that made him train harder, lift longer, and fight through pain that would have stopped most men. In the early 1980s, while other kids were playing hockey, Chris was in small, rundown gyms in Alberta, learning how to fall, how to take a hit, and how to make it look real. He didn't just want to wrestle, he wanted to become wrestling, and that hunger paid off. By the time he turned 20, Chris was already touring Japan, working for New Japan Pro Wrestling, a dream for any young wrestler. There, he honed his style, sharp, technical, and brutal. His body became a weapon, his mind became a machine. He wasn't a showman like Hulk Hogan or The Rock. He was something else, the silent killer. In Japan, they nicknamed him the Wolverine. Chris built a reputation that followed him wherever he went. He wasn't flashy, but every wrestler respected him. If Benoit was on the card, fans knew they'd see something special. He'd hit a flying headbutt from the top rope that made crowds gasp, and then he'd just stand there, face calm, eyes steady, as if pain didn't exist for him. By the 1990s, Benoit had become an international name. From ECW to WCW, he was climbing the ranks, earning titles, fans, and scars along the way. He wasn't the biggest man in the locker room, but his work ethic made up for it tenfold. And backstage, everyone said the same thing. If you want to learn what dedication looks like, watch Benoit. But behind that dedication was an obsession. Every loss haunted him. Every botched move ate at him. He wasn't just wrestling other men, he was wrestling himself. When he finally joined the WWE in 2000, it felt like destiny. The quiet Canadian kid had made it to the top of the mountain. He was sharing the ring with legends, Kurt Angle, Triple H, Shawn Michaels, and fans loved him for one simple reason. Chris Benoit made wrestling feel real again. He wasn't cutting long promos or cracking jokes. He didn't need to. His eyes, his silence, his intensity, they said it all. He'd walk into the ring, lock his opponent in the crippler crossface, and fans would rise to their feet. For a few minutes, everyone believed, this man is unbeatable. Then came the biggest night of his life, WrestleMania 20. March 14, 2004, Madison Square Garden. After years of fighting, bleeding, and sacrificing everything, Chris Benoit finally became the World Heavyweight Champion. As the referee's hand hit the mat for the third time, Benoit broke down in tears. The crowd roared. Confetti rained down, and out came his best friend, Eddie Guerrero, to hug him in the center of the ring. Two men who had spent their lives fighting for respect, now standing as champions. It was supposed to be the peak, the dream fulfilled. But in hindsight, it was the last moment Chris Benoit would ever truly be happy, because behind those tears of joy, something darker was already forming. Years of concussions, unspoken injuries, painkillers, steroids, and the silent pressure of perfection, all buried beneath that championship belt. To the world, Chris Benoit had everything: fame, family, legacy. But deep inside, his mind was beginning to break, and no one, not even his closest friends, could see the cracks forming. But behind every hero, there's a man. And behind that man, sometimes, lies a storm no one can see. The family man. After the triumph of WrestleMania 20, Chris Benoit seemed to finally have it all: the title, the respect, the family. But in truth, his story was only beginning to darken. At home, he wasn't the Wolverine. He was just Chris, husband to Nancy and father to Daniel. Nancy was no stranger to the wrestling world. She had once been known as Woman in WCW. Confident, glamorous, fiery. She wasn't just a manager. She was a performer, a part of the show. That's how she met Chris. Their chemistry was undeniable, even on camera. In the late 90s, she managed Benoit in storylines. But what started as a scripted partnership soon became something real. They fell in love behind the scenes, and it caused chaos. Nancy was married at the time to another wrestler, Kevin Sullivan, who ironically booked the storyline that brought her and Benoit together. It started as fiction and ended in real heartbreak. Nancy left her husband for Chris, and in wrestling circles, that became infamous. It was as if Chris Benoit's life was blurring the line between performance and reality, something that would happen again, years later, in a much darker way. By 2000, the two married, and soon after, their son Daniel was born, a quiet, sweet boy with his father's gentle eyes. For a time, they were happy. Photos from that era show Benoit smiling, genuine, relaxed, at peace. He would carry Daniel around backstage, introduce him to other wrestlers, and tell friends he wanted to give his son the stability he never had growing up. But life in WWE was brutal. Chris was constantly traveling, wrestling 5, 6 nights a week, flying from one city to another. He'd come home physically broken, ice packs on his knees, tape around his wrists, bruises across his back. Nancy wanted a husband. Daniel wanted a father, but the WWE wanted a machine. And Chris, he didn't know how to say no. As the years went on, the toll began to show. He'd spend long nights alone in hotel rooms, rewatching his matches, criticizing himself frame by frame. Even when he won, he found flaws. Even when he was loved, he felt unworthy. Nancy noticed it first. She saw the changes, the mood swings, the quiet dinners, the sudden bursts of anger over small things. He'd stare off into space, lost, distant. And when she asked what was wrong, he'd just say, "I'm fine, I'm just tired." But it wasn't just exhaustion. It was something else creeping in, something invisible. His friends started to worry too. Eddie Guerrero, his best friend and brother in spirit, saw it more than anyone. They trained together, prayed together, cried together. Eddie would tell people, "Chris is too hard on himself. He doesn't forgive his own mistakes." And when Eddie died suddenly of heart failure in 2005, Benoit shattered. He didn't just lose a friend. He lost his emotional anchor. At the funeral, he sobbed uncontrollably, clutching Eddie's casket as if refusing to let go. Other wrestlers had to help him stand. In the days that followed, Nancy said she barely recognized her husband. He cried constantly, isolated himself, and would call Eddie's voicemail just to hear his voice again. That grief never left him. It dug deep into his mind, twisting something that had already begun to crack. By 2006, their marriage was under strain. Nancy filed for a restraining order at one point, saying Chris had become controlling, paranoid, even frightening. But she later withdrew it. She still loved him. She wanted to believe the man she married was still in there, somewhere. When he was home, Chris tried to make up for the distance. He'd spend hours with Daniel, watching cartoons, teaching him how to do push-ups, playing on the living room floor. But even in those tender moments, Nancy could see it. His eyes empty, like he was there, but not really there. He would talk about Eddie one minute, then go quiet the next. He'd forget things, lose track of conversations, and sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, shaking, gasping for air. Nancy once told a friend, "It's like he's fighting something we can't see." And she was right. Because behind the closed doors of their home in Fayetteville, Georgia, something was happening to Chris Benoit. His brain, after years of concussions, chair shots, and headbutts, was beginning to betray him. He was losing the ability to separate pain from peace, the ring from reality. But no one knew it yet. To the outside world, he was still the disciplined athlete, the family man, the hero. The same man who'd once stood in Madison Square Garden with tears in his eyes, holding his championship high. But inside, the man was fading, and something else, something darker, was slowly taking his place. Part 3. The Breaking Mind. The year was 2005, and the applause had never been louder. Chris Benoit, the machine, the perfectionist, stood in the middle of the ring, sweat dripping from his forehead, fans chanting his name, "Benoit, Benoit, Benoit." But inside, something had begun to shift. Behind every flying headbutt, every suplex, every diving move from the top rope, was a man who was breaking from the inside out. The headaches came first, sharp, splitting pain that made him clutch his skull after matches. Then came the memory lapses. He'd forget conversations, lose track of days, even forget to return calls. Nancy, his wife, noticed it early. "Chris, you don't seem like yourself," she'd say softly, watching him stare blankly at the television after putting their son Daniel to bed. He'd force a smile. "Just tired, babe. Just tired." But it wasn't fatigue. It was damage, years of head trauma, unhealed concussions, and silent suffering that would soon consume him. When Chris's best friend, Eddie Guerrero, died suddenly in 2005, something inside Benoit shattered completely. Eddie wasn't just a colleague, he was family, the brother Chris leaned on through every storm. At Eddie's funeral, cameras caught Benoit clinging to his coffin, tears soaking the polished wood. Those who were there said they had never seen him cry like that. He was inconsolable. After that day, Chris was never the same. He started isolating himself, stopped talking to friends. When Nancy tried to comfort him, he'd just sit there, staring at old photos of him and Eddie, whispering under his breath. The gym became his only escape. He'd train for hours, punishing his body, trying to silence his thoughts. He looked stronger than ever, but everyone close to him knew something was wrong. Soon, paranoia crept in. Chris began keeping journals addressed to Eddie, writing page after page as if Eddie were still alive. In one, he wrote about missing him. In another, about not feeling in control anymore. Nancy grew worried. She confided in friends that Chris's mood swings had gotten worse. One moment, he'd be calm and affectionate. The next, explosive, unpredictable. There were whispers about steroids. And it was no secret. WWE's locker rooms were full of performance enhancers back then, and Chris was obsessed with maintaining his edge. The roid rage theory would come later, but at that moment, it just looked like a man trying too hard to keep up with a crumbling world. By 2006, the tension at home was unbearable. Nancy had filed for divorce once, even getting a restraining order. But like many troubled marriages, they reconciled, out of love, out of habit, out of hope that things could be fixed. She told a friend, "He's not the same man I married." Chris was moody, distant, sometimes lost in thought during dinner. Daniel, their young son, didn't understand why Daddy seemed sad all the time. He'd tug at his father's arm, showing him drawings, asking him to play, and Chris would smile for a moment before drifting away again. In the locker room, his colleagues noticed it too. He had become quieter. He'd avoid small talk, show up late, and sometimes sit alone in dark corners before his matches, staring at the floor. One wrestler later said, "He used to be intense in the ring, but after Eddie, he was intense everywhere. It was like he couldn't turn it off." By now, Chris had multiple untreated concussions. His brain was being silently destroyed. But in 2006, few people, not even the medical experts, truly understood CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The idea that repeated blows to the head could cause violent mood swings, paranoia, or depression wasn't yet mainstream knowledge, so everyone assumed Chris just needed rest. He didn't. He needed help. Then came the texts. Friends recalled receiving strange messages from Benoit, short, cryptic, out of nowhere. Sometimes he'd say he was fine. Other times, he'd say he didn't feel right. One message, months before the tragedy, simply read, "I'm lost." At this point, Nancy's worry turned into fear. She confided to a friend that she thought Chris was mentally unstable. She even told someone that he'd begun keeping Bibles around the house and that he seemed obsessed with religion and death. Chris wasn't sleeping well. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, pacing, mumbling, as if haunted by something unseen. The man who once embodied discipline and control was slipping away, replaced by confusion, paranoia, and silence. Inside his own mind, Chris was at war. The hero everyone loved was still there somewhere, but fading fast. And within a year, the world would see just how broken his mind had become. So broken that love, faith, and reason couldn't save him. Part 4, The Weekend of Horror. It started like any other weekend, Friday, June 22, 2007. Chris Benoit was supposed to be in Houston, Texas, performing at a WWE live event. The fans expected him, the Wolverine, to take the stage as always, but instead he stayed home in Fayetteville, Georgia, with Nancy and Daniel. What no one knew was that this would be their final weekend alive. That Friday evening, neighbors recalled hearing raised voices coming from the Benoit home. Chris and Nancy had been arguing again, loud enough that someone walking past the house could hear muffled shouts. It wasn't new. Their marriage had been tense for months. But this argument, it sounded different, longer, heavier, final. At some point that night, the shouting stopped, and silence took over. Inside that silence, something unthinkable happened. Investigators would later piece together what they believed took place. In a moment of rage or madness, Chris strangled Nancy in their home office. There were signs of a struggle, but she never stood a chance. He placed a Bible beside her body. Then he went to sleep. The next day, Saturday, June 23rd, the house was still. The blinds were drawn. Nancy's car sat in the driveway. Friends began texting Chris, wondering why he wasn't answering calls from WWE officials. He replied with short, strange messages, claiming Nancy and Daniel were sick from food poisoning. But inside the house, he was spiraling deeper into a dark, broken state of mind. At some point that Saturday, investigators believe Chris sedated his 7-year-old son, Daniel, using medication from his home. Then, in what remains one of the most haunting acts imaginable, he placed his own hands around his son's neck and squeezed until the boy was gone. Daniel, small, innocent, still clutching a toy, was found in his bed. A Bible lay beside him too. 2 lives gone, and Chris wasn't finished. Sunday, June 24th. By now, WWE officials were panicking. Chris hadn't shown up for his pay-per-view match in Houston. He was supposed to win the ECW World Championship that night. But instead of calling anyone back, Chris began sending out cryptic text messages to friends, to colleagues, even to fellow wrestler Chavo Guerrero, Eddie's cousin. My physical address is 130 Green Meadow Lane. Dogs are in the enclosed pool area. Garage side door is open. The texts made no sense at the time, but later they'd serve as breadcrumbs, the way investigators would find the bodies. Sometime later that day, Chris sat alone in his basement gym. He wrapped a weight machine cable around his neck, adjusted the pulleys, and let the bar fall, breaking his neck instantly. The autopsy would later show that his death was methodical, deliberate, not impulsive. He planned it. He knew what he was doing. When police entered the house the next day, the stench hit them before the truth did. They found Nancy's body first, wrapped in a towel, then Daniel's, still in bed, then Chris, hanging from his equipment. 3 lives, 3 Bibles, one of wrestling's greatest heroes, gone in the most horrifying way imaginable. The news broke on June 25, 2007. At first, no one believed it. WWE announced his death before they knew the full story, a tragic misunderstanding that would become infamous. They aired a full tribute show that Monday night, filled with tears, memories, and wrestlers speaking about their fallen friend. Superstars cried on live TV. Vince McMahon himself spoke with grief in his voice. But then, as the details came in, the truth hit like a hammer. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a tragedy of fate. It was something much darker. Within 24 hours, WWE pulled the tribute. Every mention of Benoit vanished from their website, their programming, their history. It was as if he'd never existed. Back in Georgia, the house at 130 Green Meadow Lane was sealed off with yellow tape. Reporters swarmed the quiet neighborhood, neighbors whispered, and the wrestling world fell into silence. No one could understand how Chris Benoit, the man who loved his family, who trained harder than anyone, could do something so monstrous. But the answer, as investigators would soon find out, didn't lie in steroids or rage alone. It was buried deeper, in the brain of a man whose mind had been slowly destroyed over years of punishment, loss, and untreated trauma. The weekend of horror was over, but the questions had only just begun. Part 5. The Fallout, Wrestling's Darkest Day. The morning of June 25, 2007 started like any other in the wrestling world. Superstars were preparing for Monday Night Raw. Fans were buying tickets, and the name Chris Benoit was still respected. The quiet legend, the family man, the perfectionist. But by noon, everything changed. When Fayetteville police entered the Benoit residence, the scene was so grim that some officers had to step outside to breathe. 3 bodies, a Bible beside each, no forced entry, no struggle outside the walls. It was clear this was a murder-suicide. Detectives worked quickly, piecing together timelines, text messages, and the autopsy reports. And by late afternoon, the story had reached WWE headquarters. That's when the world found out. Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their son Daniel were dead. Inside the WWE offices, phones were ringing nonstop. No one knew what had happened. At first, there were rumors, carbon monoxide, an accident, maybe even a home invasion. But as the hours went on, confusion turned into dread. That Monday night, Vince McMahon made a decision. Without confirmation of the details, WWE canceled the planned live show and instead aired a 3-hour tribute to Chris Benoit. It was emotional. Clips of his best matches, heartfelt interviews, friends crying on camera. Superstars like Triple H, Shawn Michaels, and Edge spoke through tears about the man they knew, the humble, dedicated wrestler who would give his all in the ring. But before that tribute was even finished airing, the truth had started to leak online. By the next morning, headlines exploded across the world. WWE star kills wife and son, then himself. Fans who'd cried the night before were now shocked, disgusted, angry. The wrestling community fell into chaos. Vince McMahon appeared again, this time cold and shaken, to issue a statement. There will be no further mention of Mr. Benoit's name ever again. Just like that, Chris Benoit was erased from WWE history. The backlash was massive. The media stormed WWE like sharks to blood. Every news channel, CNN, Fox, ABC ran wall-to-wall coverage dissecting wrestling culture, drug use, and the brutal schedule performers endured. Reporters called it wrestling's darkest day. Congress even got involved, demanding explanations for steroid testing and wrestler safety, because police had found anabolic steroids in Benoit's home, and that opened the door to one burning question. Did roid rage drive him to kill? The autopsy results made the case even stranger. Benoit's body showed traces of steroids, painkillers, and anti-anxiety medication. But it wasn't enough to explain what happened. Friends swore he wasn't a violent man. His coworkers described him as quiet, disciplined, almost too controlled. Something didn't add up, and that's when researchers began to look deeper, inside his brain. While the world was turning its back on Benoit, Dr. Bennett Omalu, the same neuropathologist who discovered CTE in football players, requested to study his brain. The results were shocking. Chris Benoit's brain had the same severe damage as an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. Years of head trauma, diving headbutts, steel chair shots, concussions had turned his once brilliant mind into a maze of scars and decay. He wasn't just broken emotionally, he was broken physically, from the inside out. But for the WWE, it was too late. Sponsors pulled away. Fans burned Benoit merchandise. Tributes vanished from YouTube. Within weeks, Chris Benoit became the ghost of wrestling, a man no one dared mention. Nancy's family demanded answers, and they got few. Her sister, Sandra Toffaloni, spoke publicly saying, "This wasn't the Chris we knew. Something else took over him." And that something else, the slow rot of brain damage, depression, and unspoken trauma, would change sports forever. In the months that followed, WWE introduced a wellness policy, banned unprotected chair shots to the head, and started testing for concussions. But for many fans, it was too little, too late. Because no matter how many reforms they made, the question still echoed, could this have been prevented? The legacy of the Wolverine, once a symbol of strength, now stood as a chilling reminder of what happens when pain goes untreated and the mind finally breaks. The wrestling world tried to move on, but the shadow of June 2007 never left. Every new wrestler who stepped into the ring carried that ghost with them, a silent warning of how thin the line can be between glory and destruction. As one fan wrote online, "We lost 3 people that weekend, Nancy, Daniel, and Chris, but we also lost the illusion that our heroes can take endless pain without breaking." Part 6, The Brain That Broke. The ring was silent. No crowds cheering, no lights flashing, no music echoing through the arena. Only memories and questions that no one could answer. What really happened to Chris Benoit? How did a devoted husband and father, a man who lived for perfection, spiral into an unthinkable tragedy? Was it rage, drugs, or something much deeper, something that had been growing inside his brain for years? When doctors examined Chris's body, what they found was horrifying and heartbreaking. His brain was severely damaged. The tissues that controlled memory, emotion, and impulse were deteriorating, scarred and hollowed out. Dr. Bennett Omalu, the neuropathologist who had already shocked the world by linking head injuries to NFL players' deaths, looked through the microscope and quietly said, "This man's brain is not normal. It's the brain of someone 85 years old with dementia." They had a name for it now, CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a silent killer that had been eating away at athletes for decades, hiding behind trophies, fame, and applause. Chris Benoit's case became the most public, most horrifying example of what happens when the human brain simply breaks. His style of wrestling, the high-flying diving headbutt, the neck-cranking crippler crossface, had earned him fame and pain in equal measure. For years, he shrugged off concussions. Backstage, he'd tell younger wrestlers, "You just shake it off and get back in." He was from the old school. No excuses, no complaints. But inside, every slam, every fall, every unprotected chair shot was rewriting his brain chemistry. Neurons misfired, rage grew, empathy dimmed. Sleep disappeared, and depression took root, deep, silent, and deadly. By the time of his death, researchers counted over 30 areas of major brain damage. His amygdala, the part that controls fear and emotion, was almost destroyed. His hippocampus, the area tied to memory and rational thinking, had shrunk. He could still function, still wrestle, still smile for the cameras, but his emotional brakes were gone. His body looked like a champion's, his mind a battlefield. And that, doctors said, might explain everything. When the report went public, it shook the sports world to its core. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about wrestling. It was about football, boxing, hockey, soccer, every sport where players hit their heads and got up pretending they were fine. Benoit's story forced the world to look closer, to realize that under every helmet, behind every tough guy's smile, there might be a brain slowly breaking down. One of Benoit's close friends, Chris Jericho, said later in an interview, "We loved him. We hated what he did. But if his story can save even one person, then maybe it wasn't all in vain." The WWE couldn't erase what happened, but it changed because of it. Chair shots to the head were banned. Mandatory concussion protocols were introduced, and young wrestlers were told, if you get hit, you sit out. It was too late for Chris, Nancy, and Daniel, but their deaths became the spark that ignited reform across an entire industry. Still, not everyone forgave. Some fans refused to say Benoit's name again. Others quietly watched his old matches, tears in their eyes, remembering the man they once cheered for. Because the hardest truth of all was this: the monster who took those lives was also a man broken by the same system that built him. Chris Benoit's brain is still preserved in medical research labs today, studied by scientists who want to understand what happens when trauma becomes too much for the mind to bear. Every slide under the microscope tells a story of pain, passion, and the cost of silence. Because in the end, that's what killed him. Not just the concussions, not just the drugs, but the silence. The silence of a man who couldn't admit he was breaking. The silence of an industry that looked the other way. And the silence of a world that still doesn't know how to grieve for a fallen hero turned villain. Today, when fans remember Chris Benoit, there's no easy answer. Was he a monster, a victim, or both? Maybe the truth lies somewhere between the cheers of the crowd and the quiet of that empty house in Georgia. He wanted to be remembered as the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. But in the end, Chris Benoit became something else entirely. A warning, a wound, a legacy written in tragedy. And as science continues to uncover what happened inside that broken brain, one question still haunts everyone who knew him. Was it the man or the monster his mind became? If you were drawn into this story, don't miss what comes next. Subscribe now, because next week we dive into another true story, one even darker and even harder to believe.